My guest at this time is Daniel Oliver, chairman of the Education and Research Institute. ERI is calling attention to its American History Book project, which highlights biased and inaccurate rendering of American history for students. The book causing the most concern right now is entitled The American Pageant. It's a book used by millions of high school and college students for decades. So why does this textbook raise particular concerns? Is this an isolated incident or one of many? And what can actually be done about something like this? We'll discuss all of those questions. And Dan, thanks very much for being with us.
You're welcome. Glad to be here.
First, let's start with a brief explanation of why you launched the American History Book Project. How big of a problem is this?
Well, it's a major problem. There are dozens of American history textbooks used throughout the country. We took a look at them and decided that the American Pageant was probably one of the four most widely used textbooks. It's a little hard to get the numbers, so you can't really pin that kind of stuff down, but it is widely used, and it is widely used in AP history courses, which means that so the best and the brightest of the students read this textbook, or a lot of them read this textbook, and so some of our best students are getting a very warped view of American history, and so we thought this was a good book to tackle first. We hope to go on and tackle others, but you have to begin somewhere, so we began with this one.
How does one decide what's biased? Inaccurate, obviously, is a little bit easier to decide because all of us have some sort of perspective on assessing what happened and why it happened and that sort of thing. So how do you determine what's biased and what's just maybe not quite right?
That's a fair question because there's a lot of history and there are a lot of facts, and so inevitably you wind up making certain judgments. But and some of the stuff is very exciting and some of it's not. But the textbook says things like transcontinental railroad building was so costly and risky as to require government subsidies. Well, of course, that's simply not correct because although some of the railroad builders had subsidies, James J. Hill, who built the Great Northern Railroad, received no federal subsidies at all, and it was so successful that it was the only transcontinental railroad not to lose money in the Panic of 1893. So it is simply factually wrong, but also if you read the rest of the chapter, you understand that the authors have a bias against private industry and in favor of government, and always subsequently in the textbook in favor of government regulation. So they talk about how wonderful government regulation was and how the government was able to tame the barons of American industry for the benefit of the consumers. Well, that just isn't true. But it's not only not true, it's also a bias in favor of large government and against private industry.
And we should point out that on the website, and I'll give you a chance to give that website in just a minute, you go chapter by chapter in this book, highlighting different pieces of the text and explaining why it's biased and in many cases why it's also inaccurate, about how the Western settlers essentially ravished the natural resources with no regard to sustainability and that sort of thing, and essentially labeling the federal government as the hero of saving our natural resources and so forth. Is there any particular passage in the American Pageant that stands out to you?
Well, there are about 100 of them. My favorite, which is it's not just bias, it's inaccuracy, is the one on Alger Hiss. They say Alger Hiss was being chased by an ambitious red hunter who was Richard Nixon. And then they say that Alger Hiss went to trial and was convicted of embarrassing and was caught in embarrassing falsehoods. Well, he was caught in embarrassing falsehoods indeed. He denied that he was a communist spy. They proved otherwise. The statute of limitations had run on convicting him as a spy, so the only charge the government could get him on was perjury. They got him on perjury and sent him to jail for, I've forgotten, 5 or 10 years. But the perjury was denying that he was a Soviet agent passing documents to the Soviet Union. So, and the book we critiqued was published in 2002. I think it is not fair to say that even in 2002, serious people thought that Alger Hiss was only caught in embarrassing falsehoods. But since that time, they have issued a number of revisions, the most recent one being the 16th edition, published in 2015. And the passage on Al-Jahis has not been changed. So they are still saying in 2015, in a book that they charged students $200 for, that Al-Jahis was caught in embarrassing falsehoods, when in fact he was a communist spy. And that's just unbelievable.
A couple of minutes left in our time with Dan Oliver of the Education and Research Institute. And Dan, this might be harder to quantify because you obviously can't talk to every teacher who uses this book. But based on the work you've done, do you think most teachers are able to spot the problem areas and perhaps correct them in the classroom? Or are a lot of these people brought up on the very same textbook, just an earlier edition, and so they assume this is correct?
I think they're brought up on the same textbook or other textbooks that were just like it. Not all of them, of course, and there are some other textbooks, but I suspect many of them are brought up on these kinds of textbooks. And unless they have really studied American history, unless they're really graduate students in American history, they probably don't recognize some of the falsehoods and biases. And, the textbook's 1,000 pages long, and they haven't got the time, or my guess is the skill, to go through 1,000 pages and pick out the errors in each page. And they haven't got the time, and they've got, 50 kids in the classroom, and they've got to move on because they've got to get through the assignment by whenever, December or June or whatever. And so they may correct some of it if they know about it, but even the ones who know all about it probably don't have the opportunity to correct it all. And probably the best ones, if they have any choice, don't use this textbook. But in the public schools, my guess is that most of the textbooks are chosen by what we might call a textbook committee, and the teachers don't have any say over what they teach. So I think you have millions of students soaking up this kind of stuff, and that's just deplorable.
Dan, we see surveys from time to time about what the American public in general doesn't know about our founding and about American history. We see it from the right. I think the Intercollegiate Studies Institute has a survey that they do. We just had one this past week from the Woodrow Wilson National Fellowship Foundation, which reported that only 13% of those surveys knew when the U.S. Constitution was ratified, even on a multiple choice exam, by the way. Most thinking it was 1776. More than half didn't know which countries the United States fought in World War II, 60%, and 57% didn't know how many justices serve on the nation's highest court. So two questions here. What's the impact on our young people, and how do you think it's impacting how young people are engaging in our actual political and otherwise national debates?
Well, I think that most people, most students, don't go on to become American history buffs. And my guess is they forget most of what they learn very quickly, which is, again, that's what most people do, so that's not really picking on them. But they have a sense, I think, after reading textbooks like this, that business is bad and government is good. Government will protect you against greedy businessmen. So they grow up with a bias against business and against the economic power of the United States. If they would, even if you're not reading the textbook, if you just go to our website, trueamericanhistory.us, and read the commentary, you could read the whole commentary in an evening, well, maybe 2, maybe 3, and get a sense of the issue and the problems dealing with textbooks. So, and then have a sense of what you need to be careful of when you listen to other people talk. But, I read a book about how useless education is by somebody, and I forgot what the name of the book was, but he said they've surveyed college students, and something like 14% of them, of the graduates of the nation's colleges, didn't know whether the sun revolved around the earth or the earth revolved around the sun. So we have a problem with education. It's not limited to American history.
Lastly, what do you hope this project accomplishes? What can people actually do to make sure that students are getting an accurate view of American history?
I think 2 things. One is tell the students that the resource is available and they can read it. And even if they're reading a different history book, not the American Pageant, which is the one we have critiqued at trueamericanhistory.us, but even if they're reading a different American history textbook, they could sign on to our website and type in the first, the name of whatever the person who is being criticized is, and go to our section and get the true scoop. So it's useful even for people who are reading a different textbook. And then it's also just interesting for people who want to know something about American history and about bias in textbooks. They can read through or critique instead of reading the textbook. And third, we're hoping that it is sort of a warning shot fired across the bow of people who write American history textbooks, that put them on notice that as time goes on, we hope to put their textbook on the web too and critique it the way we've critiqued American Pageant.
Dan, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you, sir, very much for your time today. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Daniel Oliver is chairman of the Education and Research Institute. I'm Greg Columbus reporting for Radio America.